Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Greetings from the Paterson Museum. This is probably one of the most exciting talks I've given in a long time. Normally, I do the general history of Paterson, the textiles, locomotives, and Wright's Aeronautical for such a short period in Paterson, just about 25 years of manufacturing. They left probably one of the biggest impacts in world history. This is the beginning of a three-part series. So this first presentation will give us an overview on Wrights and their activities. Part two will concentrate on the famous flights and their engines, particular models that they made. And lastly, we'll really dive into the people, the right way of working, the way the employees worked, the way they played, unions, and a whole lot more. But this first one will give us a just general overview on where it all started from. So I'm going to begin with my PowerPoint presentation. Okay. Okay, it is the Wrights Aeronautical and the Golden Age of Aviation in Paterson is the key word for me. Now, even in any of Wright's advertisement, or of course, anytime you think of flight, you can't, the first word in flight is Wright and the Wright brothers. And we all know about their famous December 1903 Kitty Hawk adventure where they flew really just 120 feet. And that really is going to lay the groundwork for, all future aviation, including getting us up to the International Space Station. Wrights had started developing planes really as early as 1903. They had thousands of glider tests, but really they don't get any recognition until about 1908 when they finally go before the Army and they really are showing a real flight where they could travel about 125 miles at a 40 mile an hour per hour, and they could sustain flight for well over an hour. And the biggest problem they initially had was really not getting off the ground, but getting engines that weren't that heavy. They originally had looked to Europe and they were trying to get specs that would give them an engine that weighed less than 33 pounds per horsepower. And their initial flight was only about, needed a 12 horsepower engine, and no one could really help them out. So they figured, what the heck, we'll make our own. And they made an engine that only weighed about 13 horsepower, 13 pounds rather per horsepower. So quite innovative. And at the bottom of the slide there, you'll see the very first aviation factory in the United States. That's at the in Dayton, Ohio, where the Wright brothers would begin. And I do like the one shot of the airplane engine that they were originally building, the straight six. Keep that design in mind for a later shot. The most important thing that the Wright brothers had, and where they actually spent more time, defending their patents as opposed to continuing developing airplanes and airplane designs, because everybody initially started building their planes essentially. So they had to really, establish themselves. And one who was really in the forefront was Wilbur. Wilbur was traveling to Europe throughout the United States to continue to enforce their patents, which they were able to secure, and they did get their royalties. But this took a real health issues for him. It took real toll on him, and Orville always lamented that this is probably what caused his brother when he contracted typhoid and died, because he spent so much time traveling and doing the business end. So much so that by 1915, Orville's really kind of done with it. And actually, he really wasn't the business end of it anyway. He was the inventive genius. He liked tinkering with the engines and all. And of course, around 1915, there's a war going on. The first war to end all wars starts in 1914. And it's also the very first time where they're looking at aviation as a means of offense and defense for the first time. And the primary engine that was used to these early planes was the Hispano-Suiza, which was a French-Spanish design. And during the war years, Europe's being bombed and everything else that's going on. They just can't produce enough engines. So they're looking to America. We're not involved in the war yet. And so through licensing agreements, Wright had contracted that they would start building the engines, similar to what you see here. That's a V8 engine, liquid cooled. And it made anywhere from 150 to 180 horsepower. Of course, when they first sent them here, it was quite the engineering feat because all of the measurements were in the metric system. So the first thing our engineers had to do was convert them to inches, and it was not easy, especially once they sent the engines back, because then the French would have to reconvert them. But they did work out those bugs rather quickly. However, as I mentioned, Orville was kind of done, and the Wrights company needed a new partner. And what they did is they formed the Wright Martin Company, and it's really three manufacturers that are going to merge for this $10 million venture in 1916. The first one is with Glenn Martin, who's an aviator out in California, and in New Brunswick, where they're building the Simplex automobile. So these three firms merge, and they're going to take over the contract to supply Europe with the engines it needs. This is, again, Glenn Martin. Just want to mention him quickly. Early aviator, and Martin Industries, Lockheed Martin, his company still exists today. He was only involved with them for only about a year or so. Around 1917, he pulls out because he wants to go back into more airplane production instead of just engine building. Although what I thought was really neat, some of these guys really were quite characters. And he's building his own planes out there in Santa Ana, and to raise money, he's offering flying lessons to train aviators, and he's also working in the movies. He's a stunt pilot. He would do his own flying, and he does a little acting with Mary Pickford, America's sweetheart, at one time. And as you can see, so he did just about anything to finance his company. So merging was actually a real blessing for him. And the Simplex Model 5 was a rather expensive vehicle that was produced here. They had a major manufacturing plant, but production was winding down on automobiles. And so you had a skilled labor force and a plant that could actually tool right up for, production. And that's pretty much how, Wright Martin begins. Really, they're building their own Hispana Suiza, and then they start converting it and, improving upon it until it becomes like the model Wright engine. And they would drop out the Hispana Suiza moniker. As you can see here, the World War I military inspectors would be involved. One of the very first one was a Captain Frank Rentschler. He would be inspecting for the Army, as well as later he would become the head of Wright's. So aviation, a lot of the gentlemen left the military and they went into the commercial end of things. And a typical, whether it was the Sopwith Camel and a few other planes, but they all used, again, this liquid cooled engine, which was not the most reliable. Liquid cooled, it leaked, sometimes it overheated. However, during, the European theater where they were fighting, and many times, especially the way navigation was, you just landed in a field. As long as it was flat enough, you didn't need that much of a runway. And when navigation, as I mentioned, normally the way they would travel is they would either follow the train tracks, and every now and then they'd actually would just land and look at the street signs. This is the way, planes first got around, long before we had Waze and our GPSs of today. Now, they had about 15,000 employees manufacturing, thousands of engines. Of course, war turns to peace eventually, quite fortunately. But as for the manufacturer, they had a company now in a factory about 12 times the size they were going to need it. There was no commercial aviation really at the time. People weren't getting on an airline. The main way to travel by rail throughout the continental United States. And if you were going abroad, well, then you got on a steamer and sailed across the Atlantic or so. So what were they going to do? So they reorganized, and they get down to just, a few hundred people, and they rename themselves the Wright Aeronautical Corporation. And that name will remain as an independent company from 1919 to 1929. And they do start at New Brunswick, and the mayor of New Brunswick and the community was really hoping they were going to stay there. Again, their plant was way too large, so they had actually sold most of it off to International Truck Company, and then they leased it. And for a year or so, it looked like they were going to stay, but then all of a sudden the rumors start coming around. They're going to Newark, they're going here. Every place was mentioned but Paterson, but they still were manufacturing the engine and they were improving upon it. As I mentioned, the very first Suizas really were about 180 horsepower tops. Now they're cranking out 300. And, besides military uses, they were using them for airmail. Although this interesting plane by Thomas Morse, actually the 300 horsepower engine was too strong for it, and it was rattling the plane apart almost. So it didn't see too much service. But that's where they began with commercial aviation, airmail, and then later it's going to get to commercial for traveling abroad. These are the only advertisements I could find, and this was important to me because it says the Wright Aeronautical Corporation, and you can rewrite at the bottom, New Brunswick. Because I always thought that when they reorganized as the Wright Aeronautical Corporation when they settled to Paterson. So that is not true. So for the first few months, they were still based there manufacturing engines, and there was hope that they were going to stay. Paterson was not on their radar, and airplane engines wasn't on our radar either as you looked at the old city. Paterson was also in a time of transition. Now, we still had the locomotive industry, but it's winding down. This is the Cook Works by the under the auspices of the American Locomotive Company. They were based by Madison and Getty Avenue. You see their plants there. Actually, on the right side, this would be Madison Ave right here. This plant, not to jump around, but later this would later get absorbed by Wrights, just to give you an idea of the square footage that they would need under future expansions. But anyone who was around could see that the locomotive industry is winding down. By 1926, it is completely gone. And by 23, they're not even really building ground up constructions. As for the textile industry, again, more and more companies were moving out. You didn't need as many employees as things were getting more skilled. But more importantly, what people remembered was the Great Silk Strike of 1913, which really paralyzed the industry for 6 months, and it did not bounce back, and it was slowly declined. And after World War I, it would begin, a very slow decline all the way through the 1940s. And of course, this got the interest of the Chamber of Commerce because they're trying to figure out how can we attract new industries. Attracting new textile wouldn't have been a problem because you had factories that could handle it, but they were looking for the heavier machinery. Even an extensive woodworking firm could not relocate to Paterson. They had quite a few offers. So what they did is they came up with this idea that made a stock company, the Paterson Industrial Development Corporation, in 1916. And they had this idea to build a series of buildings, which they really looked at as an incubator project. That's pretty much the way they called it. And the first thing they did is they had to raise money, and they were planning to raise about $250,000. I think what they came out with at least 240, so they're pretty close to their initial goal. And they started purchasing properties along the Erie Railroad by Madison Avenue, all along the line there. They purchased about 116 lots. Your basic lot in Paterson was about 25 feet by 100 feet. And for the most part, they got them for about $350 a lot. And then some of the more expensive ones were 500. And then in 1916, they start building this building. This could be the state of art, concrete, fireproof, steel reinforced. We're not building a brick building. We're building something that a heavier industry could come right in. And they really had the idea that, build it and they'll come. And then this one building was really their model. They really had the great intention of building 8 of these buildings on the sites. But after a year or so, nobody was really moving in. They had lent some of the floors out, but they really weren't seeing the action they were hoping because they did want to return on their investment. Now you got this 4-story building, 90,000 square feet, and they had 1 or 2 little machine shops. And then since the war came out, the Army actually had contracted most of the building to use as a warehouse, and they were moving ordnance through here. So up through the war, at least they had somebody occupied, but of the hundreds of employees they thought they'd get, they only had about maybe 40 to 100 that really ran the whole place. And it looked like they weren't going any further. And come around 1920, some of the investors are panicking and they're like, forget the idea of building 8 more. They just want to sell the building, maybe. Although some others said, no, we got to hang on to it. So they try to come up with a plan. What happened was the Wright Aeronautical Corporation was looking for a new place, and Paterson was perfect. We had the great location right there on the Erie Railroad, and you had a brand new factory. And so they leased half of it, and then they were able to take the rest off once the other leases were completed. So it was about $35,000 a year. And after 5 years, they could purchase the building, which is what they really wanted in the end. So this is how it really got started. And it was really Paterson trying to attract a new business by building a new building and hopefully this facility again. But it took 4 years before it actually, saw some action. And right as this new industry is about to take place, we have this major plan from Europe, especially Great Britain, to dump all these engines. I mentioned, they had thousands of engines, and they figured they're just going to flood the markets. And what was created was the Aircraft Disposal Company. And what they did is they had purchased from the British government 35,000 engines and about 10,000, they called them airframes, but that would be the fuselage and wings. And they just had them stockpiled. They paid £1 million for them, and their deal with the government is the British government is they would sell them, and 50% of the profits would go back to the to Great Britain. As soon as we caught wind of that here in the United States, because some of the engines looked like they were going to sell for like $75. They're like panicking here. So courts get involved, and Wright's was really leading this because they try to protect their patents, because when they merged again, they kept the original Wright brother patents on building engines as well as planes, and so they were really fighting their European competitor there. But they were able to sustain. And so they continue to develop the Hispano-Suiza, which was now the Model H as it got bigger. They also started working on going into airplanes as well. And actually, they'll build a few planes. You'll learn more about them in my next talk. But I thought this one was one of the first planes they built, which was named in honor of Wilbur. And you see in the back here, you have Orville was present, and who did the actual christening was their sister, Catherine. That was actually the very first flight she ever took in a plane in 1922. So this is one of the first projects, and I thought it was interesting is that they're really looking at hydroplanes taking off from the water, and of course they were also looking at to secure military and naval contracts. But as I mentioned, they did build a few more engines. The Hispano-Suiza, which again was the H model, an 8-cylinder. Now they expanded to a 12-cylinder, the Tornado, more power, and that could crank out almost 600 horsepower when all was said and done. And this was one of the Navy flyers. It seemed like the Navy had the greatest interest. Again, there was no Air Force at the time. Later would follow would be the Army Air Cadets and the Air Corps. Another things they try to branch out to in 1922 is we had the models of our own Zeppelins that were to be made. They did eventually settle on the Maybach engine, but they contracted rights to build 3 engines for the Shenandoah class, which they successfully did, but not to be funny, it didn't really take off. However, we do have one example of this engine, which you can see at the Smithsonian. This is almost a one-off. Again, there are 3, as far as I can see, only 3 were ever made. They were tested, but never employed in our Zeppelin fleet. But the Navy was very desirous of, maintaining its air fleet and developing it further. But they often had problems with the liquid-cooled engine. Again, overheating, leaking. Again, they learned how to take off from carriers. You have like the USS Langley here. But if you couldn't make it back, you were in a lot of trouble. And they were looking for a better engine. And who had developed a really great engine out in Long Island was Charles Lawrence and the Lawrence Aero Engine Corporation. He developed a radial air-cooled engine. This is the J1. And he would also develop 2 and 3-cylinder engines. They had less parts, they were lighter, and they were far more efficient. And of course, they were never going to leak water. And they wanted his invention very much, but he didn't have the manufacturing might that Wright's had. Wright Aeronautical was banking everything on its liquid-cooled engines. It had plenty of military contracts, and they really weren't interested in going too far with the development of this. And then the Navy came in, and the Army said, if you don't start making this engine, we're going to pull all our contracts. So they came up with the solution that you two should work together, and eventually they, of course, would merge in 1923. And they would make Charles Lawrence would become the vice president, and he brought the patent for the engine that really would make Wright's Aeronautical the powerhouse that it would become. His J1 would be developed to the J2, J3. By the J3 is finally a production engine. And typical of Paterson, again, there's one photo with the assembly line production. It reminds me when we talk whenever we talk about Sam Colt, the gun who won the West and all. His first manufacturing plant was here in Paterson, and he didn't invent the revolver, but what Sam Colt did is he invented assembly line production, or the factory system. That's as early as 1837 to manufacturing of firearms, and then every industry you look at would follow suit. And of course, you get the Wright's Aeronautical streamline production here as you work on your part of the engine and send it down. And when you look at these photos from the 20s, other than heavier machinery moving and more efficient, the plant modernized throughout the years, but in the 1940s, you could recognize what's going on one after the other. Their most famous engine that really started making news for them would be the J4. And this is another airplane that they made, the Wright Belanca. Giuseppe Belanca was an airplane designer. He would later break off and make his own. But this plane is particularly important because it was powered by a Paterson engine, and that Paterson airplane would also cross the Atlantic back in 1928, 29. Of course, there's a lot of famous flights that we need to examine. from Admiral Byrd. He flies over the North South Pole when the very first woman in 1928, as she went as a passenger. Amelia Earhart, a few years later, she would fly it as a solo pilot. But of course, the most important would be Charles Lindbergh. And he powered the J5 that was designed for Wrights for him. And actually, that historic flight really starts in Teterboro. Went from Teterboro, where all the testing was. That's where Wrights had a hangar, and that's where as soon as they built an engine, they would go to Teterboro, put it on a plane, and they would test for height, altitude rather, speed, and endurance. They did try more than once to build an airport in Paterson, but unfortunately, it was not to happen. And based on how small we are, we could see it would have never been like Newark International is to this day. However, the engine that flew from New York to Paris nonstop, May 20th, 21st, 1927, made Wright's the most important company. And as for publicly traded stock, it went right through the roof. And of course, his was recognized by President Coolidge. It gave the Collier Award of Achievement to Charles Lawrence. And as a result, everybody wanted to work with him and his designs. Now, Paterson was on its way to becoming the aviation city. We were already, locomotive city. They still know us as the Silk City. Aviation city, I thought, well, I don't know. I think that's pushing it a bit. And then I remembered New Standard Aircraft Company. They were based in Paterson from 1927 to 1931. You can see their buildings are still standing. Google Maps comes in handy, on East 18th and 8th Ave. So they were actually manufacturing airplanes. And of course, the engines were supplied by Wright, who was in Paterson. Here's a couple examples. There's actually about a half a dozen of these planes from the 20s still in the air. And the one on the left with the maroon body, you can actually fly in that yourself if you go up to the Rhinebeck, or the aerodrome in their aviation center. And they just restored her, I think, only a year or two ago. And it's powered actually by a Wright's J6. So you get a chance, you can actually fly in a real Paterson aircraft. They're still going. And again, we really had some high hopes. Here's 1929. The Paterson Morning Call came out with a special edition, on aviation. And of course, it was only centered around Wrights and New Standard. Unfortunately, 1929 becomes a pivotal year in October when the stock market crashes. Wrights was affected, but not nearly to the extent that the New Standard was. A New Standard runs out of business by 1931. They dissolve, and unfortunately, they don't come back. But Wrights does manage to, continue through. In 29, they also have the greatest merger of aviation that took place. There was about 10 different independent companies, mostly led by the Curtiss Corporation and the Wright Aeronautical Company, forming $70 million. You can see it was like the biggest news coast to coast. The Curtiss-Wright was forming. Interesting, Glenn Curtiss was an aviator from Hammondsport, New York, the Finger Lake district. There's an amazing museum up there, as a matter of fact, too. And you can see some of our engines as well as his products there. Wright brothers did not like him at all. He was really their main competitor in the air. They always felt maybe he had stepped on their, patent toes a few as well. But in the end, they would actually join forces. I'm a motorcycle enthusiast, so I was always a hero of him. Interesting, again, they were the Wright brothers are bicycles. Well, Glenn Curtiss started in bicycles too, but he took it to the next step with motorcycles. I cannot imagine going 136 miles an hour on a modern motorcycle that can exceed that quite a bit compared to that bicycle with a V8 engine in the middle of it. Looks pretty scary. But these are the guys that would do this type of stuff. They're flying in the air. And the one bottom shot here is test in Atlantic City. So, the East Coast is where a lot of this all took place. Again, we had plenty of land, but more importantly, we have a lot of wind around here. That's the main reason just to cut back, why they chose Kitty Hawk, because Kitty Hawk was one of the best places where winds could be sustained. And when the merger came, they called them Curtiss-Wright, as you may know. We still know of the company because it still exists to this day. However, even though Orville was long removed from the company, when he heard about the merger, and even Wright's always used the first name in air production is Wright, and he wrote to them, "Could you make this the Wright Curtiss company?" But it fell on deaf ears. Now, what they did is they had extensive works there. Glenn Curtiss did in Buffalo, New York. So again, they shut down all of that. He continued to build planes. The Wright, Curtiss-Wright was an airplane builder, but airplane engine production was solely concentrated in Paterson. These were his plants right before they closed and moved in 31. They were also building an air-cooled engine, the Challenger. You can see it's the R600. It's two rows. Even if when you see it from the side, you'll notice one cylinder slightly offset from the other to help with the cooling. Wrights would develop this a little further, but production was very low. He was also in the manufacturing of V-twin liquid-cooled engine, the Conqueror. That was also a V12, pretty powerful. Wrights would develop it through the early 30s to 32 with the Super Conqueror. However, most of those actually more of them ended up in boat production than airplanes. But there was some military applications that wanted this plane, so they did build it. But Wright's real main engines would be Whirlwinds and Cyclones. It was really the J4 that gets the moniker, the Whirlwind, and they're larger, more powerful. Like you see here, they're 14-cylinder Cyclone. A beautiful plane by Boeing. This is one of their Clipper class. This was really when they had real big hopes. We just came out of the Depression, and we're really now have planes that could travel. Oceanic flight was possible. We can go from across the Atlantic from New York to Europe. We could get out to Hawaii, and they started developing planes and airlines. And then, of course, 1941 happens, and World War I breaks out, and that really stops the international flights. And unfortunately, it would actually even kill off this plane, which you could see from the schematic inside. It was quite luxurious. I mean, it was really quite the thing to be flying in one of these flying fortresses. Just to give you an idea, there's over 50 companies that Wright supplied power to. As I mentioned, as a publicly traded company, they were doing pretty good. Their only problem was they didn't innovate enough. They took their few engines and they kept improving. They were mostly known for their 9-cylinder engines, the 1820, all the way up to like 3,350. During the war years, over 140,000 engines are going to be built in 5 plants in and around Paterson. They'd have plants out in Cincinnati, Ohio. They just kept expanding and expanding. When they first started in Paterson in 1920, they had 90,000 square feet and 300 employees. By the time World War II was well underway, they would end up with nearly 20,000 employees, 3 shifts, 24 hours a day these were running. So much so that the noise was driving everybody insane that lived along Lewis Street and the areas. They were always complaining to their aldermen, and they really wanted to shut the Wrights plants down. Everybody wanted Wrights in. However, when they were testing engines all night, but they needed to because they had to do further developments, you're in the middle of a war, we have to improve. We have to improve. And, people were understanding, but you still needed your sleep, and it was a little tough for them. The first engine that really makes the news would be their R2600 14-cylinder for the B-25 Mitchell Midway bomber. One of the very first attacks when we finally reached back to Japan after what they did to us on Pearl Harbor were the Doolittle raids of April of 1942. Actually, they had to fly a little earlier because they were detected by Japanese Navy. So none of the ships, rather, none of the planes made it back to the aircraft carrier. And you could read on the story of them. They had it really rough, those flyers. They didn't really inflict much damage on Tokyo, but they did enough to, wake them up. And it did a lot for our morale to really get us behind the war effort. So this was one of the first significant, strikes by our Army Air Corps. And what you find out after the war, where this was plotted, could this work, was at the Alexander Hamilton Hotel. Employees from Wright's, their engineering division, talking about the specs and the capabilities of their engines, assured the generals that it was General Doolittle that this could make it. Actually, it was a lieutenant colonel. I'm sorry. So of course now we got to start hiring people, and Wright's was hiring not only for Paterson but later the Woodridge plant. Every day of the week, they were looking for employees, and they were having a high turnover, not necessarily because you weren't trained and couldn't do the job, but they, over the course of the war, lost 15,000 men. They would train them for a year or so, and then their draft number would come up. So they would have to go really in our service. This is your basic paper in 1942, and I cut most of the ads out. Wrights, Wrights, Wrights. They became the largest single employer that Paterson ever had. And at its height, the locomotive industry, say the Rogers Works, they would hire 2 to 3,000 men. Wrights did 10 times that. I do like some of the ads, though. I always like the husky men one because I'm thinking to myself, it's like, well, definitely, I would not be looking to apply for that job. But some of their key elements are men over 26, because again, the draft age started at 18, and they were taking all the young guys first, and they were trying to make you become an essential war worker. And it was, get in the fight, work it right. There's actually films that you could watch if you go on YouTube. You can see some of the promotional World War II theme base to get you, all excited about, supporting the war effort. And of course, we needed a lot of women working. We had our Rosie the Riveters. They actually had a hard time at first, but very soon after, they were able to make the right stays, because what they had to do was help with some childcare. Women were staying home, and they were, moms. Even if their husband was away, they still had to take care of their children. And Wrights had to figure out those. So they worked out a nursery plan for them. And we do have, one little shot of some of the actual Rosie the Riveters that actually would replace their husbands. Their husbands would been a former employee at Wright and now was serving in the European or Pacific theater, and and your wife would step in for you. And some you'd have three generations even working. It'd be the grandfather, father, and now his son or his daughter was working at Wright's. And as I mentioned, there were 5 plants in and around Paterson. The main plants were centered right here. This is plant 1 and 2. And then they had plant 3. They start leasing them here and there. Plant 4 in Elmwood Park, the former East Paterson, and in Fairlawn. When you cross the Fairlawn Ave Bridge, the factories to the left, which was later a dye house, that was also converted for Wright's parts. What you see here is plants 1 and 2. It all started with this one wing, and then they just kept expanding, expanding, expanding. This section here, which is plant 2, was originally part of the American Locomotive Works, and they added these glass buildings in front. And then what you see in the lower part here, this was all the test cells. Today, this is Route 80 self-storage. This is where all the noise was coming. In each one of these towers, you see there would have been an airplane engine suspended and being tested for, how fast it can go, how long it can go at full horsepower. The Fairlawn Ave plants. Also, part of that was later would be for the Dumont TV manufacturer. And some of these buildings are still standing. Here's Elmwood Park. Actually, that's where the Dumont, I'm sorry, where the factory was. And then the largest plant ever made would be in Woodridge. This was in 1943. The federal government built this building, and it would be just for one type of engine at first. Our main engine that we really produced was the 1820, and there were several variations. The most important was for the B-17 bomber program. We built thousands of these engines mainly for the European theater. Again, it was a mid-range bomber, could not travel the great distances. But these engines were pretty bulletproof. The Memphis Bells gets a lot of attention, and Hell's Angels was probably the first that actually secured 25 missions. And actually, after 40 missions, they came back and they were doing a goodwill tour. And of course, the main place they stopped was Paterson, because they'd have almost 1,000 hours with no overhaul, no servicing for these engines. And they were just, again, bulletproof. And I not to be funny. So this is when they were visiting Paterson, plant 1 and 2. One thing I learned, and I knew former Wrights employees growing up in Paterson, I never heard that some of our engines went in tanks. They would just have to give them cooling system because they were an air-cooled engines. They had fans blowing on them. But the M3 Sherman and Grant tanks were powered by smaller airplane engine, the 975. You could get an idea of the, you could see it's a perfect radial engine. You just never thought about it. It's upright, and it would be cooling behind it. As for the plant in Woodridge, that mainly was limited to manufacturing the R3350, which Wright's largest and most powerful. Is an 18-cylinder engine, and it really ramped up production, especially in 43 and 44, as the European theater was winding down, and we needed the long-range bomber in the Pacific. So this was really the engine that ruled the skies for the Super Fortress. And then once the war settled down, Wright's has to now. They ran into the same problem Wright Martin did. We got all this land, we have all these factories, and got rid of the people. But like they shut down the plant for a couple of weeks immediately afterwards, and then they only hired back who they needed. They had to apologize because they didn't need anybody now. When the war ended, it was like just like switched off done with production. The military did honor about $80 million in contracts because they had tons of engines in production, but they canceled all their orders, but they didn't, they get stuck eating them. So now they're moving into commercial airliner. And it really looked like Wright's was going to stay because they didn't need that giant plant. But I think some of it was the noise issues of testing plants. And once they made it affordable enough, Wright's would just relocate to the Woodridge plant in 46, 47, and everything was really consolidated under one roof, which really makes the most sense. The biggest problem we've always had in Paterson is we have such a small footprint. If you see our factories are all 4 and 5 stories. As you know, production works better in a straight line. Your raw materials parts come in one door and work them down the line. That was the one thing we never could really offer here in Paterson because we're only, again, 8.4 square miles, and originally had to be so close. Your power was either the water originally before electric and all. So it's just being an old industrial town. We just couldn't compete with, an area of land that could spread out. Woodridge, just to give you an idea how massive it was, 1/3 of the available land of Woodridge to live in was occupied by the Wright Aeronautical Corporation. Of course, this is all gone now. Everything's been erased. However, you can still see almost all of Wright's in Paterson. Plant number 1 is standing right along fine along Route 80. Again, just go around Beckwith Ave and Madison Ave. The test cells, which is the Route 80 self-storage, and across the street, it's not on this side of the on the other side of the highway. Plant number 2 is still running to the, as manufacturing is going on. Again, you no longer, unfortunately, have one industry that would occupy, this immense works. And when Wrights left Paterson, they abandoned 2.3 million square feet. They had started with shortly, just like I said, around 90,000. In total, they had almost 8 million square feet of all their factories. So again, one of the most impressive operations that Paterson ever saw. Last one of the longest impacts. And again, only 25 years, but they really here for the golden age of aviation. And again, whenever you think of an air endurance record, an altitude record, and a speed record, it was done with a Paterson engine. And you'll learn all about that in my second talk. Also, by the time we start our next talk, through the Paterson Museum Foundation, they've been able to track down an engine for us. So we recently purchased an engine. It should be shipping out tomorrow from Texas. We're going to get an 1820, a 9-cylinder engine, but that was used in mid-30s, around 1933, 1935, for the DC-2. So we're real excited about getting a complete Paterson engine on permanent display at the museum to augment our, industrial offerings. So again, whenever you think of the world, who made the world smaller? The Wright Aeronautical Corporation.
So the first question, you may have answered it because it was already put up before you talked about the different factories, but it was there a factory in Totowa Borough outside of Paterson for Wrights?
In Totowa, no. In Clifton, there was, and I don't really touch on that. That was where originally the propeller division was before it moved out to Caldwell.
And the other question that we have here is from Keith, and he's asking, do you know about early history of aviation patents, and was Wright patent challenged successfully at any point?
Wright's defended its patents, tooth and nail, and they were always successful.
So as Jack mentioned, this was the first part of a 3-part series. The next portion of this presentation is going to take place on April 8th. We are going to send out an email, so don't worry if you don't have your calendar with you right now, but just keep that in mind. On April 8th, Jack's going to be telling the next part of the story. So that program is going to be about powering the golden age of aviation. And that's going to talk more about the famous flights and things, right, Jack?
Yeah, that'll talk about the particular engines and the airplanes, as well as the airplanes that they built. I see one of the questions, I talked about the test cell. Why are they designed? They tested every engine. Every engine actually went on over 50,000 checks for parts and all before they stuck it in the air. And then they would run them at full capacity, right to red line. And they had no mufflers on these things. And, it was in a solid block building. However, it was deafening. You have one from Vince about the rotary engines that they built at Woodridge. Actually, when we did our Wright years, one of the first exhibits I was here for back in '85, we did the Wright years in Paterson. We had a rotary model, and it was funny is we had the only rotary available. The Smithsonian didn't have one. They had loaned us a J5 for the exhibition, and then they asked if they could have that because they didn't have one in their vast collections. So we gave it to them. It's on display at the hangar in Virginia. So I do know about the rotary engine. The Wright brothers did not live in Paterson. They were in Ohio. That's where they were based. Although the Wright company was really the headquarters was New York City, but they lived in Ohio. They did come to Paterson. That would only be Orville because Wilbur had passed early. He came a few times and was treated as he should have been, as aviation royalty.
And Pam wants to know what part in building an engine would a miller have done? So it sounds like a specific.
Actually, milling the machinery goes through the cylinder. Actually, milling is a little bit more general because they were milling the crankcase, the cases, anything that needed to be drilled out, hollowed out. Milling was quite extensive in the Wrights. Again, when they weren't just casting eventually. So it's really shaving down and all.
We have another question in the chat. Robert is just wondering, what are the continuing activities of the Curtiss-Wright company?
As you know, I don't know off the top of my head. Go on their website. They're building smaller engines. I know they built some things for the space shuttles in the past, parts and all, but they're still going. They abandoned airplane engine production. They shut down their the Woodridge plant in '82. Their biggest problem was they never really embraced the jet age. They thought the turboprop was the way to go. I'd mentioned the B-29 bomber engine. That was the R-3350. That could crank out just over 2,000 to 2,200 horsepower. Once they added turbocharging, now the engine was almost 4,000 horsepower, with the same cubic inches. When they did build a jet engine, they built the J65, but it was essentially the British Sapphire engine. It was used in the F-84, so they were building it for the Korean War. But it wasn't their own design. It was through licensing agreements with Great Britain.
Thank you very much, Jack. Like I said, for a great presentation. I think everybody's going to be looking forward to our program in April. And there'll be a lot of famous names. Who are some of the people that are going to be mentioned? Charles Lindbergh.
Well, we're going to have Lindbergh. We're going to have Amelia Earhart. We're going to have Chamberlain. I was going to say Richard Chamberlain, the actor. Charles Chamberlain. You'll have Bert Acosta. And my favorite you're going to have will be Eleanor Smith, the famous flapper from Freeport. She was a better flyer than Amelia Earhart was.
So that's a good spoiler for or a teaser rather for our next program. So thank you all for tuning in today, and we are looking forward to seeing some of you, or hopefully all of you, again in April. And remember to tell everybody who missed out that might be interested that this was recorded and is available on the museum's YouTube channel. So until then, we will see you next time.
And I will look up that answer, what Wright is doing now. One last thing, Hispano-Suiza, they're making an electric supercar. They are not out of business, by the way. So check that out on the web as well.
All right. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.